Joining us now is their Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Hi, it's good to see you. Thanks for
Morning.
joining us on the programme. Let's start with those teaching union strikes and potential strikes. First of all, should we? What impact is that going to have on kids who are about to do their exams?
Well, of course, like any industrial action, it'll be disruptive. It'll have an impact on people, but it's not easy to strike in this country. Workers are not having an easy time. They don't want to lose pay. And when you've got not just this action, but action in so many different sectors, it really comes down to people using this as a last resort. And the fact is, for most working people in this country, the last 13 years have not been easy and they've been driven to this. And frankly, the response from government has got to be an acknowledgement that that's the case, that they are the ones responsible when it comes to public services. They're going to have to negotiate, and simply trying to legislate to pretend this state of affairs doesn't exist by the kind of laws we're seeing proposed in Parliament today. It's a mistake. It won't work. It will actually make these disputes even harder to resolve. And so, the bit I object the most to be honest, is the sense the government have that workers themselves don't understand the disruption that is taking place. Of course they do, but they have been driven to this, and the government's got to understand that. And if they don't understand that, frankly, they'll never get to the bottom of a resolution in any of the sectors that are affected.
So you do condone strike action during exam periods?
I think any working person only strikes as a last resort. And people, particularly in public services, who love their job, who see it as a vocation, they know the impact it will have. And nobody wants to see strikes take place. They can be resolved. It does require a willingness to negotiate. But frankly, the point of a strike is disruption. If the government doesn't understand that, it doesn't understand anything. So nobody wants to see strikes take place. But if the government isn't willing to really appreciate why they are taking place, I'm afraid there won't be a way to resolve them. And we've seen, actually, as you say, there's more hope in the railways, a little bit more of an acknowledgement there from the government that they've got to do something. Let's have some more of that across the economy as a whole.
So even during exam time is acceptable?
Well, there will never be a time when strike action in education isn't disruptive to young people who are studying. There is no easy time, as it were, to go on strike. And yes, it will have an impact on young people. There's just no doubt about that. But frankly, the solution to that is, rather than condemning workers who feel driven to take this action, the solution to that is getting down to negotiate. And frankly, we haven't seen enough of that. And the reason for that, in my view, is that the government are frankly embarrassed at the state of public services after 13 years in power. And they see in the variety of industrial actions taking place a chance to somehow use it as an alibi to switch the blame onto workers themselves, to somehow say that's the reason public services aren't performing. Most people in this country will know, even when there isn't strike action taking place, a lot of public services are not running to the degree that they should do with the expectations people have of them. So let's not get into condemning people. Let's resolve these disputes and they won't take place.
Let's talk about our beloved NHS, should we? Your leader yesterday saying the NHS needs reform. We're being told that part of that could be the ditching of GP contracts. I'm reading it in the paper this morning. That could cost an extra £7 billion. Well, is that really something that you want to embark on at this stage?
Well, what we want, Kay, is a long-term 10-year plan for the NHS that addresses the fact that it isn't working as people want it to work at the moment. Part of our plans are for substantial extra resources, abolishing the non-dom tax regime for the super rich and using that to, for instance, double the number of doctors being trained. But we've also got to look at new ways of doing things. It's a consultation. We're not being prescriptive. I think we've got to be willing to look at new ways of doing things. I think the NHS has always evolved throughout its history, specifically on the issue you raise of GPs becoming direct employees of the NHS rather than the partnership model. There are already, and have been in the last few years, substantial changes that have taken place to that model. A lot of younger medics don't want to become GPs on the old model. We've seen sort of big healthcare interests come in and buy up some GP practices. So there is change happening in this area. So we've got to look at that because it's happening. Let's look at the best way of doing that, work out how we should do that in conjunction with staff themselves. And then any costs obviously will be part of the equation. But the idea that we should never look at doing things in a different way or seeing if there's improvements that can be made, I think that would be a mistake. Of course, more resources are required, but we shouldn't rule out reform of how we do things as well.
OK. Your boss seemed to get himself in quite a pickle yesterday when he was talking about patients making self-referrals. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think it already exists in some forms of treatment. I think, again, if we're having a consultation, why not look at how that could play a bigger role? Not for everything, clearly, but for some areas, I think it could. One of the real problems I see quite regularly is the struggle to get to see a GP because they're so under resourced and because the capacity isn't there. You've got to obviously get in with a phone call early in the morning. That does put more pressure on A&E as more and more people simply go straight to A&E because they don't feel they can get to see their GP to do that. So again, if there's different ways we can do that, release some of that pressure. As a whole, I think everyone agrees, as a national health system, the NHS, we're in a position too often where we're spending too much on hospital care. We're not getting in with the treatments people need before they get to that acute stage. And again, if you're having a consultation about the long-term future of the NHS in a public model, delivered in a public way, but looking at how it interacts with patients, again, let's look at also new ways of doing things as well as getting more capacity and resources into it.
Just to be absolutely clear, what does Labour think at the top table think we should do if we think we have internal bleeding?
I'm not going to get into specific treatments and how they should be dealt with. This is a point of principle.
But the leader did yesterday, didn't he?
Well, look, I think the best way forward on this is to say we're looking at different ways of how the NHS can work. We want to do a consultation with patients, with GPs, as the best way to do that. There are some treatments where you can go immediately to specialists already. We're looking at the evidence around that. But I think we've got to address this issue where so much pressure is put into A&Es as people turn up presenting there because they can't get to access healthcare at an earlier stage when it might be more amenable to do that. So I don't think we should ever be in a position where we are reluctant to talk about how we can change a public service as long as it's delivered in public hands in a public way. How is it interacting with patients? How can we do that better? We shouldn't shy away from that. We've put out very clear plans for more resources for the NHS, but we've got to look at how it operates and how it interacts with patients at the same time.
Yeah, if I thought that I was struggling with internal bleeding, I'd be straight on the phone to the doctor, wouldn't you?
Yes, and I think no one is saying anything that would take away the fact that GPs will always be a major part of the system. But I do think there are some things where
if you... didn't he? That's what he said yesterday.
Well, I think there are times when I'm going to give a specific example from myself, but I can think of things where I've been accessing treatment where I know what I need because it's a repeat situation where I think that could play a role. But look, this is about a long-term future plan for the NHS. I think if we were just highlighting the additional resources we put in, people would say, well, look, we've got to look at how it operates because it's very difficult to be able to call at 8 a.m. and get an appointment to see a GP. That is a real problem of the system at present.
But with all due respect, internal bleeding, Mr. Reynolds, is, potentially life-threatening. He misspoke. It's OK to say if you misspeak.
Well, I understand you're flagging that specific case, and perhaps that is something where you would always need to go and see your GP. But I don't think that should detract from the fact that what we are putting forward as a Labour Party who are looking forward to an election and hopefully becoming the government is not just a plan for more resources, but a plan for how we can make sure the NHS is fit for the future, delivers the kind of care that people need, works in a way that reflects how society and life operates at present, as well as giving it the capacity and resources to do that. To me, that is a long-term plan for a national public NHS, and that should be lauded. And I think that there'll be specific things we need to talk about exactly how it would work, but reform and resources, that is what Labour is putting forward for the NHS.
Just one quick thought before I let you go, Mr. Reynolds. We just had a young woman on the programme from Scotland. She said she knew when she was very young that she was born in the wrong body. We know that the Gender Reform Bill in Scotland means that those as young as 16 can change gender and can have the necessary paperwork to back that up. Scottish Labour agree with that. Sir Keir Starmer does not agree with that. What do you think?
I think 16 is too young without parental consent. And my understanding is people do sometimes transition younger than that. This is about whether that is just their decision alone or it's taken in conjunction with their families. I do believe, actually, when that bill was going through the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Labour voted against the reduction in age to 16. If I'm wrong on that, I'll apologise, but I believe that is how the passage of the bill went forward. So really, it's about at what age can you do this alone rather than with the support and understanding and consent of your family. We don't agree with the Scottish position in its entirety, but devolution means there will be different views on issues, a whole range of issues, and that's simply how the system works. I think you can reform the gender recognition process whilst ensuring the Equality Act and single-sex spaces are preserved, and that is the Labour Party's UK position.
It's always great to talk to you. Hopefully see you soon, Mr Reynolds. Thank you.